All right, let's dive into the world of Claire Lehmann and Quillette. We've got articles, Wikipedia, even some pretty strong opinions out there. Our mission today is Lehmann a visionary? Or is she, as some people say, a master manipulator?
Well, Lehman seems to thrive in those gray areas, pushing the boundaries of acceptable discourse, right? She and Colette, they've definitely carved out a niche, challenging those mainstream narratives and, giving a voice to people who are often called unorthodox.
Okay, so for our listener who might not know, Claire Lehmann, she's Australian, writer and editor, background in psychology, and she founded Quillette back in 2015. But before that, she was actually working for the Australian government, writing policy documents. Now she lives in Japan, which adds another layer to this global story that we're trying to unpack.
And that global aspect is key here. Because Quillette, while based in Sydney, it has readers all over the world. They cover a wide range of topics: science, tech, culture, news. But what they're really known for is providing a platform for voices and ideas that challenge the status quo. They even say explicitly there's a space for unorthodox opinions.
So it's almost like they're courting controversy.
Yeah.
And speaking of controversy, remember when Lehman met with Peter Thiel and Eric Weinstein, that whole academic hoax, the grievance studies
Oh,
affair?
yeah, that was a wild one. Where academics submitted, well, they deliberately submitted nonsensical papers to academic journals, trying to expose, in their view, ideological bias in certain fields. One of the papers was even rewriting Mein Kampf through a feminist lens.
Whoa.
It was a huge scandal, exposed some problems within academia for sure, but also a lot of questions about the ethics of the hoax itself.
And Crillette was reporting on the scandal, right? They were giving a platform to these hoaxers to explain their motivations. Their argument was that academia had become too politicized
Mm.
and had lost its intellectual rigor.
But here's where it gets tricky. Critics argue that Quillette used the grievance studies affair to dismiss entire fields of study, especially those focused on social justice. They claim it was a way to just discredit scholarship and silence those dissenting voices.
So on one hand, championing free speech. On the other hand, potentially pushing a specific agenda. And then there's those accusations of platforming racists, platforming the alt-right, especially with articles on race and IQ. Those are some serious charges.
Very serious. The worry is that Quillette is giving a veneer of respectability to what some people call scientific racism, rehashing old, discredited ideas about race and intelligence.
And what does Lena have to say about all this? She says she's just trying to broaden the Overton window. For our listener, the Overton window refers to the range of ideas considered acceptable in public discourse. So Lehman argues she's just trying to expand that range, allow a wider range of viewpoints to be discussed openly.
But the real question is she broadening the conversation in a productive way? Or is she normalizing harmful, even dangerous ideas?
She claims to be a centrist, but a lot of people see her as leaning right, especially when it comes to things like feminism and political correctness. So is Lehman a fearless crusader for free speech? Or is she a right-wing provocateur, skillfully manipulating the media for her own ends? Maybe it's a bit of both, or maybe it's something else entirely. That's what we're here to figure out.
So, one of Lehman's big arguments is against what she calls blank slate fundamentalism, the idea that we're all born like blank slates, and our environment shapes us, everything about us.
Blank slate fundamentalism. That sounds kind of extreme to be a fundamentalist about it. What's wrong with that idea?
Well, she argues this view, which she sees as dominant in academia. It ignores the role of biology
Hmm.
and genetics in shaping human behavior and, differences between people. This ties into Colette's willingness to publish those controversial articles on things like race and IQ.
So it's not just nurture, it's nature too. But how does that justify, potentially giving a platform to what some call scientific racism? That's a pretty slippery slope, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's exactly the criticism leveled at Quillette, that
Yeah.
they're repackaging these old, discredited ideas, providing a platform for voices with ties to the alt-right, even white nationalist movements. So it raises the question, is Quillette deliberately promoting these views? Or are they just naive about the potential harm?
And what's Lehman's response?
Well, she says she's committed to exploring all sides of an issue. Even those that are considered taboo, it's like she enjoys pushing those buttons.
But if she's trying to broaden the conversation, who's she talking to?
That's a really good question. She's admitted that Quillette's audience is primarily, as she puts it, highly educated urban and not really representative of, mainstream America. So it seems like she's targeting a specific niche. People who are disillusioned with mainstream media, skeptical of what they see as liberal orthodoxy, open to alternative explanations for things, social and political phenomena.
So maybe she's playing to a specific audience, people who are hungry for a different perspective. And that includes a lot of young people, right? Particularly young men.
Absolutely. Quillette has a pretty significant following among young men who feel alienated by modern society and are drawn to their message of rebellion and nonconformity. It's almost like Quillette is tapping into that sense of confected radicalism that Lehmann talks about.
You mean the idea that young people, because they haven't experienced real hardship, they kind of romanticize past struggles and create new enemies to fight? Like they're looking for something to be outraged about.
Exactly. And Lehmann argues this stems from a lack of real hardship, which leads some to romanticize those past struggles and invent new enemies. So you have to wonder, is Quillette reinforcing those feelings of grievance and anger rather than offering any real solutions?
Yeah, that's a valid concern. If they're validating those prejudices, they might actually be contributing to the polarization, making it harder to have, productive conversations about these issues.
Right. It's like they're profiting from division instead of promoting understanding.
And this brings us to another area where Lehmann's been vocal, cancel culture. She's a huge critic of what she sees as the excesses of political correctness, arguing that it stifles free speech, creates a climate of fear, on college campuses and in the media.
And she's not wrong that there have been cases where people have been unfairly targeted for expressing unpopular opinions. But critics argue that Lehmann overstates the problem and uses that fear of cancel culture to silence her own opponents.
It's interesting, there's also the hypocrisy of Quillette itself, engaging in cancel culture by banning users and deleting comments they disagree with.
Yeah, that's been pointed out.
So is Lehmann really a champion of free speech? Or does she just want free speech for ideas she agrees with?
It all goes back to that question of intent, right? Is she genuinely committed to open dialogue? Or is this just a tactic to advance her own agenda?
Which, according to her critics, is to promote a right-wing, anti-feminist, and often racially charged agenda. But it's important to acknowledge, Quillette has published some thoughtful, well-researched pieces on a variety of topics.
Oh, absolutely. And they've given a platform to some writers who have been unfairly sidelined by mainstream media.
But those pieces often get drowned out, don't they, by the more sensationalistic and inflammatory content that Quillette's known for.
Yeah, it's almost like controversy is the strategy.
And that raises the question for our listener. How do you separate the signal from the noise? How do you engage with platforms like Quillette without getting sucked into those echo chambers?
It's a tough balance. We need to be critical thinkers, discerning fact from fiction, being aware of the biases and agendas at play.
Right. We can't take everything at face value, especially when it's coming from sources that have a clear agenda.
And while it's important to engage with viewpoints we disagree with, we need to recognize that Quillette isn't neutral. It presents complex issues in a very simplified way, offering easy answers to tough questions.
Which can be tempting, right? Especially for young people looking for certainty in a confusing world.
Exactly. But that kind of simplistic thinking can be dangerous.
Because it reinforces biases and discourages critical thinking.
Right. The real world is full of nuance and complexity. We need to embrace that, even when it's uncomfortable.
So is Quillette ultimately a force for good or bad?
It's probably a mix of both. They've challenged conventional wisdom, sure, and provided a platform for some marginalized voices. But they've also been accused of platforming hateful rhetoric and exploiting division for profit. It really comes down to each individual to decide how they want to engage with it.
We've talked a lot about the content and the criticisms, but what about Lehmann herself? What are her core beliefs, and how do they shape Quillette's direction?
Well, she describes herself as a centrist, but a lot of people see her as leaning right, especially on issues like feminism and political correctness. She's very critical of what she calls the excesses of the left, arguing that political correctness stifles free speech, and identity politics is, tearing society apart.
She's been especially critical of modern feminism, calling it a victimhood cult. That's doing more harm than good.
And these aren't necessarily fringe views. A lot of people share these concerns. But the criticism is that Lehmann often presents these arguments in a very simplistic, one-sided way, ignoring counterarguments and resorting to, personal attacks.
So it's like she's more interested in winning the argument than having a nuanced discussion.
Right, which brings us back to that central question. Is Lehmann a visionary or a villain? A genuine intellectual or just a clever manipulator?
It's tempting to want a clear-cut answer, isn't it?
It is.
But as we've seen, the truth is much more complicated. Lehmann's a complex figure. She's intelligent, ambitious, and she's a master of the media game. But she's also been accused of promoting harmful ideas, exploiting division for her own gain.
And her legacy will probably be debated for years to come. That's what makes her story so fascinating. She embodies that tension between intellectual curiosity and the potential for manipulation, the fine line between challenging the status quo and exploiting people's fears.
And that's a tension we all have to grapple with, right, as we navigate this world. Overflowing with information and conflicting narratives.
Absolutely.
Before we wrap up our exploration of Lehmann, we need to look at one final piece of the puzzle. A story that really gets to the heart of the question. Can people really change? Richard Hanania, remember him? The writer who went from, extreme right-wing views to renouncing them publicly. It's a fascinating story.
It really is.
And to get to the heart of what we're trying to figure out today.
Yeah, for sure.
He was a contributor to Quillette, and even after his, earlier, more extreme writings surfaced, caused a huge controversy, Lehmann still chose to publish his essay, My Journey Out of Extremism, I think it's called.
That's right.
I mean, that's a pretty risky move, right? Most publications would have just distanced themselves completely from someone with that kind of baggage.
Oh, absolutely.
But Lehmann, she kind of doubled down. She even wrote an editor's note, arguing that Hanania's story was actually a testament to the possibility of redemption. This is a story we need to hear about personal growth, the ability to change.
Right, a redemption arc.
But how do we know if Hanania's transformation is genuine? Is it even possible to completely shed, such deeply held and, in this case, harmful beliefs?
That's the million-dollar question.
I mean, Hanania himself acknowledges that, right? He describes how he used to construct, these elaborate justifications for his extreme views, even when he knew they were harmful. He talks about wanting to be contrarian, to push back against what he saw as the hypocrisy of the left. So was he just playing a role then? Were those extreme views all an act?
Well, he doesn't frame it as a deliberate act, more like a kind of self-deception, like he was shielding himself from confronting his own flaws and biases. Makes you wonder how many other people might be doing the same thing, right? Convincing themselves of things they don't truly believe just to fit in or to score points in these, ongoing culture wars.
It's like that confected radicalism that Lehmann talks about. Young people who are so desperate to rebel against something, even when their lives are objectively pretty good.
Exactly. Lehmann argues it comes from that lack of real hardship. So people end up romanticizing past struggles, inventing new enemies to fight.
So maybe Hanania's earlier views came from a similar place, like an existential angst, a need to feel like he was fighting for something meaningful, even if it meant embracing these harmful ideologies.
That's possible.
But then Hanania's story changes. Right. He says that personal and professional success actually made those extreme ideas less appealing.
Interesting.
He suggests that people with good lives are less likely to be drawn to those kinds of ideologies.
That's a fascinating idea. Could our material circumstances actually influence our beliefs? Something for our listener to think about.
So Hanania's story adds another layer to our deep dive, doesn't it? Into the world of Claire Lehmann and Quillette. It raises all these questions about the nature of belief, the possibility of change, and whether we can ever really know someone's true motivations.
Absolutely.
It reinforces the idea that there are rarely easy answers, especially when it comes to these really complex issues. We've seen how Lehmann built this platform that thrives on controversy, challenging mainstream narratives, platforming those unorthodox voices, some more palatable than others. And it's that willingness to platform those voices, even someone like Richard Hanania, that makes her such a polarizing figure. So after spending all this time unpacking your story, are we any closer to answering our original question? Is Claire Lehmann a visionary or a con artist?
I think the answer, like with most things, is more nuanced than a simple label. She's clearly intelligent, ambitious. She's built a successful platform, pushing boundaries, sparking important conversations.
But she's also been accused of platforming, hateful and dangerous ideas.
Right.
Manipulating the media, potentially even profiting from division and controversy.
Yeah.
I guess whether you see her as a force for good or a master manipulator really depends on your own perspective and where you stand on the issues. But one thing's for sure, Lehmann's a master of the media game. She knows how to use controversy, how to frame narratives to her advantage.
Right.
And that's why it's so important for our listener to be a critical consumer of information. We have to be aware of the biases and agendas out there, to be able to separate fact from fiction, and ultimately, to think for ourselves.
Couldn't agree more.
Quillette, under Lehmann's leadership, has become a powerful voice in these ongoing culture wars. They've challenged the way we think about things, push those boundaries and given a platform to a really diverse range of voices.
For sure.
But they've also been accused of, platforming hate, fueling division, and oversimplifying these complex issues to fit a specific narrative.
Right. It's a platform that demands careful consideration and critical engagement.
Absolutely. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the world of Claire Lehmann and Quillette, we'll leave you with this. Engage thoughtfully, question everything, and never underestimate the power of narrative in shaping how we see the world